Hello there, it is time for my favourite video of the year, which is my favourite books of the year. I'm going to be honest, this year I normally do 10 books and I haven't had 10 books that have stood out for me enough to put them in this video this year, which is kind of sad, but I also think my standards are kind of raising as I do this for more years, and it's kind of harder for books to appeal to me enough to put them in this video. So the books that I've got here are really good and books that really did speak to me. I just haven't got as many of them as I usually do. I think I've got 8, so I'm only 2 down, so it could be worse. Anyway, this could be a while, so let's get straight into it. The first book is Possession by A.S. Byatt. I have to say, I think I read this in like February of this year, so my memories of it are pretty sketchy, but I tend to write them down as I'm going, and this is one that I put on my list first. This is a really interesting and fantastic book. I believe it won the Man Booker many years ago, or was shortlisted or something along those lines, and I can completely see why. Now, a lot of people don't seem to like this. They think it's pretentious, they think it's too much. I actually thought this was really skillfully done. As I say, my memory of it is pretty sketchy, but I believe it's about a man who comes across letters that were written between poets, and we get the story of him trying to work out their romance and their relationship, and also the story of their letters, and it's really just cleverly done. You kind of get 2 stories running parallel to each other, but it's really just subtle and really effectively done, I think. Kind of just a book with so many layers in it, and I just thought it worked really effectively, and the writing was beautiful, so there's that one. Then I have an audiobook to speak to you about, which is How Not to Be a Boy by Robert Webb. Now, I'm going to be honest, I was kind of sceptical about this. Didn't really know much about Robert Webb other than the fact that he was on Peep Show, and I kind of, when he brought this out, I thought it was just going to be a typical comedian memoir, and I had no real interest in reading it because I didn't really know him. But then so many hype and rave reviews started coming out that I saw this on Audible and picked it up. It's narrated by him as well, which, if you've been around for a while, you will know is always a plus point for me with audiobooks. Now, this is such a fantastic book, and I wouldn't say it's a celebrity or comedian memoir at all. Yes, it looks at his life, but it predominantly focuses on the idea of gender, and it's the first book that I've come across, and I'm sure there's others, but it's the first book that I've come across that looks at gender from a male perspective. There are a lot of books out there, like Girls Will Be Girls by Emer O'Toole, fantastic book, one of my favourites from last year, but it looks very much at this issue from a feminist standpoint and what gender does to girls, and obviously the gender expectations that are put on females, but I think it's also important to talk about the gender expectations put on males. And Robert Webb effectively just looks at his life growing up and through school and university, and the way that he has always been a sensitive boy. He's always been quite in touch with his emotions, he's always related to himself as a feminist as well, and his father was a very macho man, and he never really accepted Robert, and it kind of looks at the impact that his father's expectations had on him, and the way that a lot of his emotions he felt he had no choice but to bottle up. This also interestingly looks at feminism from a male standpoint. Obviously, being a more sensitive man, Robert Webb saw a lot of the ways that the boys around him and even his friends were treating the females around them and in their lives, and he really couldn't get on board with that, and he speaks about that, which is really interesting. I just think this is a fantastic book, and I've since watched a speech of Robert Webb. It was on the BBC iPlayer for a while. When he was at Hay Festival, he gave a speech, and he was speaking about gender and the way that we gender even like unborn babies. If we find out that we're having a male, we will instantly lower our voice a few octaves and things like that, and it's just stuff that you don't even realise you're doing. And I think if you enjoyed Girls Will Be Girls by Emer O'Toole, you would definitely enjoy this. It's not as factual based, it's definitely more focused on Robert Webb's life, his experiences. He doesn't go into the research like Emer O'Toole does, but it's still so fascinating, and as I say, I think it's a really refreshing look at a topic like this. And also his delivery on the audiobook is fantastic, because there are some really sad moments in here, but listening to him narrate it, he kind of brings humour into it at points as well. I just thoroughly enjoyed this. It was definitely the best audiobook I listened to this year. Then I have got The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. This has been on my radar for a while. In fact, I've had it on my shelf for a long time, and it's a book that I've just never gotten around to reading. This also won the Man Booker, I think back in 1990 something, and it's just a phenomenal book. I really didn't like this when I started reading it. It follows a family in India, and we are from the perspective of one of the sons, I think, and it starts at one point and then it goes back to a flashback, and then within the flashback you get a flashback, and that does happen throughout, and it is sort of disorienting, but once you get into the reading style of this, you really get into it. In that sense, it kind of reminded me of A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Emma McBride, as in when you start reading it, you're just thinking, what the hell is this? And then the more that you get into the pace of it, the more that you just get immersed in this world. It's not a happy book. It looks at quite harrowing situations in these children's lives, but I always enjoy a not happy book, so that didn't bother me at all. I would truly recommend this. I think even if the beginning bothers you, just keep reading, because honestly you stop noticing it, and definitely there's a point where something happens in one of the flashbacks, which kind of grounded the story for me, and I found that I could then use that as a reference point for the other things that were happening. Yeah, it's just truly beautiful, family saga-esque kind of book, and I could not recommend it enough. Then we've got Radiance by Catherine M. Valente. Now, if I look at this pile of books, this is probably the one that sticks out for me the most. I really enjoyed the Fairyland books. I've only read 2 of them, but I really enjoyed the Fairyland books that I read by Catherine M. Valente. So I really wanted to give her adult fiction a go, but I'll be honest, the concept of this didn't really inspire me to pick it up. This is kind of like a space-based cabaret almost. It's basically set in a world where you can travel to different worlds and you can set up on different planets using the milk from a particular type of whale on the Earth. Basically, this is a multimedia story which focuses on the idea of Severin Unk, a famous film director, has disappeared. Her father, also a famous film director, is kind of trying to unravel what happened to her, and we go along with him effectively, and we look at this from the perspective of interviews that were given by the people who were there when she disappeared. We look at films that she created when she was around, and it's kind of just this space-based mystery, but it's so beautifully written. I think that's the thing with Catherine M. Valente. She just has the most beautiful writing style, and when I first started reading this, I also thought that the different mediums were going to bother me, because there's not actually a point in this where it is just prose. There's not a bit where it's just the chunk of the story and then there's little bits of interviews and stuff. That is the book, but it's just so beautifully done, and I absolutely adored this. It's so unique as well. I think that's what really makes it stand out in your memory. I just, yeah, loved it. And then I've got a bit of a left field book. Now, this was one of my non-booktube books this year. I have been reading books that I haven't heard about on booktube to kind of try and talk about some different things with you, and that is The Flame Alphabet by Ben Marcus. Now, one of the main reasons I'm putting this in here is A, because it was one of the only non-booktube books that I read this year that really blew me out of the water, which was what I was hoping from this project, and B, it has really bad reviews, and even when I posted my review of it, which I'll link down below if you're interested, a lot of people said that they hated it, or that they studied it and they hated it. I thought this was such a fantastic book, and it was so well written. So this is set in a dystopian world where the language of children has become toxic. So parents are slowly dying when their children speak to them, and gradually the toxicity kind of spreads out into all of language. And we follow a man who is basically ends up being a researcher to find out why this toxicity is happening. And this basically focuses on the decision that parents have to have, where they can either leave their children behind and move to a safe place, or they can stay and die ultimately. And a lot of the reviews that I saw and a lot of the comments that I got on my video, it said that people just found this too bleak, and it's absolutely bleak. There are some really grim descriptions of decomposing bodies in here, but they're beautifully written, and it's kind of, it's well done. So I don't know, I mean, obviously everyone's got different thresholds, but I don't know whether that's a criticism that I would say is fair on the book, because you know, you're always going to have books that look at dark subjects, and I think if they're well done in themselves, then it's not really a fair leverage to say that you dislike a book because it's a bit bleak. But anyway, that's just me. I can go to quite far limits with my fiction, and I quite enjoy it. This is also a book that doesn't really offer any hope, but then I think the kind of dystopians that I like are dystopians that don't offer any hope, because ultimately it's not realistic to say that, you know, there's a cure and everything's fine again. That's not the way the world works, and I think what makes dystopians interesting is that they look at dilemmas in our world and things that could potentially happen, and yeah, I don't think it's realistic to say that there's going to be a cure. Only slight down point I could pick out with this book is that it does end up rushing a little bit at the end, and I find that often with books like this. They kind of keep a pace and it's quite a short timeline throughout, and then because they want to show the long-lasting impact of the situation on the world, they kind of brush over things a lot towards the end. I found exactly the same thing with Brand New World by Aldous Huxley. It kind of is just nicely rumbling along, and then it's suddenly like blah, blah, blah at the end, and this book does do that, but I can completely understand why. It's important to show the long-term implications as well, but yeah, it did rush quite a bit at the end. But ultimately I loved this book. I think more people should read it, and I don't understand the negativity towards it. I think it's probably one of the lowest rated books on Goodreads that I've ever read, which is just so unjustified, it's ridiculous. As I say, I've read a lot of books this year, and this was one that really stood out for me, so I would recommend it personally. Then I have got John Steinbeck's Working Days, which is effectively a printed copy of the journals that John Steinbeck wrote when he was writing Grapes of Wrath. It's kind of a working journal that he kept, hence the title Working Days, and it's been put together by Robert DeMott, and I absolutely adored this. I have to say, I could have screamed when I found out that this was a thing, because Grapes of Wrath is one of my favourite books, and John Steinbeck is one of my favourite authors, and I also love writer memoirs, and this is kind of that from John Steinbeck, so I was excited and I was blatantly going to enjoy it. This is so good. It's actually a book that was recommended for me from my Faber course, which is a writing course, and I can completely see why, because this very much looks at the process of writing a book. It's basically John Steinbeck talking about when he starts writing, how many words he intends to do that day, and also what he intends to write that day. So he kind of used it as a guide, I suppose. When he sat down every day, he would write this to kind of get the juices flowing and also help himself work towards that goal by the end of the day. So it's a really interesting look at the structure of a novel. It's also fascinating because John Steinbeck is arguably one of the greatest writers there has ever been, and there are points in here where he's like, this is absolutely rubbish, I'm going to trash the whole thing, you know, I'm writing the worst book of my career, and ultimately Grapes of Wrath kind of went on to become one of his most famous works, and definitely I think a turning point in his career. So it's really reassuring to see that even John Steinbeck had days where he thought what he was writing was a load of trash. Really reassuring. The only slight difference is that he wrote Grapes of Wrath, which is a very long book. I think it was about 150,000 words, he says in here, and he wrote it in about 3 months. He really just completely steamrolled through it, and I have a feeling he didn't really do many rewrites. I think it was pretty much as it is, so that's just astounding. This was also interesting because it looks in the aftermath of the publication and the success of Grapes of Wrath. There's a section at the end which is kind of his next journal, which looks at how he was feeling, what with the success of his book, and actually I think that was really interesting as well because it looks at the dark side of success, and yes, the book was huge and it made him an overnight success effectively, but he also had a lot of opposition from the government. Basically, he became quite fearful and paranoid for his life because obviously the government officials didn't like the fact that he was picking at a real issue in this book, and he was looking at immigration and the problems behind it. And he kind of became quite paranoid, either unnecessarily or rightly so, but he kind of convinced himself that people were out to get him. He thought he was going to have to fight for his life effectively. He was worried people would poison him or try to sort of knock him off under the radar, and also just generally the impact of the pure success and the fact that he felt like he couldn't go outside his door anymore, and he didn't really want that level of success. He just wanted to write, and it's, I think, also really interesting to look at that, because I think sometimes it's difficult when you send a book out into the world, I guess, and if people kind of take it and very much make it their own and kind of really jump on it, it can be difficult because you're just a little person doing some writing in your room. So it's a fascinating look at the whole process of writing, and it's amazing. I would recommend. Then I have The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman by Angela Carter. This book kind of sent me on an Angela Carter kick this year, and I've kind of decided that she's my kindred spirit in the writing world, I suppose, although a much more talented version, I will admit. This is a phenomenal book, and it's actually one that I also read for my non-booktube series, because I haven't actually heard anybody speak about this. Obviously other Angela Carter books get real recognition on booktube, especially The Bloody Chamber and her book of fairy tales. I've also heard a fair amount of books like Wise Children and also Nights at the Circus. Wise Children I also read this year and didn't really enjoy. Nights at the Circus I have yet to get to, but this, I would say, is my favourite Angela Carter, even though it's a lesser known one. This basically looks at a world in which Dr. Hoffman is effectively creating a machine which can destroy the reality principle. He wants a world with no structure, no sense, no nothing, and the, I suppose, government or the other people who want structure in the world are fighting against him and trying to stop him from removing reason from the world. And it is as bizarre as it sounds, but it is so phenomenal, and again the writing in this is so on point. I just adored it. It's a really strange book, and I think it's one that would actually probably be better on a reread, because obviously as Dr. Hoffman is unleashing his lack of reality and lack of structure on the world, the book becomes increasingly unstructured, and it kind of goes into these alternate universes and you're not really sure what's going on. But we basically follow somebody who is delving into Dr. Hoffman's madness to try and get to Dr. Hoffman and understand what he is doing. And yeah, things get mad, things get really mad, but then at the end you're like, ah, I see. It's so clever and just fantastic, and I will really enjoy rereading this, I know, and yeah, I would just highly recommend. As I say, definitely my favourite Angela Carter. I have read The Bloody Chamber, I also read Wise Children and The Magic Toy Shop this year, and none of them even came close to the glory that was this book, so I would recommend. I'm saying that for all of them. Obviously I recommend them. They're in my favourites of the year. Anyway, last one we have is a fairly recent read, and that is Written on the Body by Jeanette Winterson. I'm really glad to put this in here because about 2 years ago, when I sort of really got into Jeanette Winterson, I put about 3 of her books in my favourites video for the year because I was just obsessed. And since then I've read a few Jeanette Wintersons which kind of haven't had the same impact on me, and I kind of not fallen out of love with her as a writer, but definitely realised that everybody is going to have books I enjoy and not enjoy, and I've definitely not been enjoying the books I've read of her as much of late, especially Sexing the Cherry I really didn't like. So I was so glad to read this and just fall in love with her writing again. I feel like I've reviewed this not long ago, so you may well have seen my thoughts on this already, but this is basically, it's an unnamed and unsexed narrator, although I don't know whether it's because Jeanette's a woman. I was kind of reading it as if the narrator was a woman, but we're never told. It doesn't really state, and I think that's the point. But it kind of outlines this unnamed, unsexed narrator's relationship and affair with a woman, and it looks at love and what love means, and it's basically a big love letter to the body. There is a section in the middle called The Special Senses, where it is effectively just poems about the body, I guess, and it's just basically a rumination on love and passion and the rights and wrongs of love and what we have to sacrifice to be in love. It's just absolutely stunning. I've got a few pages highlighted, so on random I'm just going to pick out a bit. 200 miles from the surface of the earth, there is no gravity. The laws of motion are suspended. You could turn somersaults slowly, slowly, weight into weightlessness, nowhere to fall. As you lay on your back, paddling in space, you might notice your feet had fled your head. You are stretching slowly, slowly, getting longer. Your joints are slipping away from their usual places. There is no connection between your shoulder and your arm. You will break up bone by bone, fractured from who you are. You are drifting away now. The centre cannot hold. Strangely, I just picked that out at random. I think that's the part that I read in my actual review of this. So it's a lot like that. I think if you like really structured prose, you're not going to enjoy this. It is effectively just a whole rumination on relationships and effectively the body. But it's absolutely stunning and it's spectacularly written, and it's such a quick read as well. It's very short, and as I say, there is a section in here that is predominantly just poems, so there's not much writing to a page. I would just, oh, it's so good. I would really recommend it, and this is a book, after not having the greatest reading year, this is probably the book that really made me excited about reading again, so I would, as I say, recommend. Oh, funny that. Anyway, that's all of the books I have to talk to you about from this year. Please let me know down below what your favourite books of the year have been, and I will see you next time. Bye!